Washington Wild has been protecting and defending wildlands and forests since 1979, just over 40 years of activism. It all started on September 30th, 1979, when a small group of dedicated people met at the College Inn, a favorite local watering hole in Seattle's University District. That day, Fant, Ken Gersten, and 6 others launched a new organization called the Washington Wilderness Coalition. Dividing up the wilderness advocacy statewide came down to Karen and Ken covering the entire state. Karen owned a car and covered eastern Washington, while Ken covered western Washington by foot, bus, and ferry. In 1981, Washington Wilderness Coalition opened its first office with less than 50 members above the Neptune Theater in Seattle University District, and the organization's first big investment, complete with a silver Reed typewriter, paid off over 3 years. During the 40 years of activism, Washington Wild has had many accomplishments. Within a month of the 1980 eruption, Washington Wilderness Coalition helped member Susan Saul form the Mount St. Helens Protection Association. In 1982, Congress designated the area as a national monument. 5 long years of organizing and advocacy paid off when Congress passed the Washington Wilderness Act of 1984, which designated 19 new wilderness areas totaling 1 million acres. Karen Fant declared 1985 the Year of the Gorge, and the next year Congress designated the 292,500-acre Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, including 18 miles of new wild and scenic rivers. Washington Wilderness Coalition worked with Senator Daniel J. Evans to advocate for the Washington Parks Wilderness Act of 1988, which designated 1.7 million acres of new wilderness in Rainier, Olympic, and North Cascades National Parks. From 1997 to 2003, Washington Wilderness Coalition's Wilderness Volunteer Corps took urban high school students into wilderness areas for a 3-week course and trail work, followed up by a service project for their local communities. In June of 2000, President Clinton declared the Hanford Reach National Monument on the Columbia River under the Antiquities Act after a statewide advocacy campaign. In 2001, after leading statewide efforts to support protections for our remaining unroaded old-growth forest, Washington Wilderness Coalition cheered the adoption of the National Forest Roadless Area Rule. On May 8, 2008, after nearly a decade of garnering unprecedented local support, the 106,000-acre Wild Sky Wilderness Act was signed into law. It was the first new national forest wilderness area in Washington state in a quarter century. In 2008, we worked to oppose a Canadian mining company lease for a proposed open-pit gold and copper mine just 10 miles from Mount St. Helens. The lease was denied after 33,000 comments flooded the Forest Service opposing the mine. In 2011, as a party to a decade-long settlement agreement, Washington Wild witnessed the breaching of the 98-year-old 125-foot Condit Dam, opening up 33 miles of habitat for steelhead and Chinook salmon. In 2012, Washington Wilderness Coalition changed its name to Washington Wild to better reflect the scope of our work protecting Washington's wild lands and waters. In 2013, Washington Wild launched the Washington Brewshed Alliance, a new outreach initiative working with more than 60 local craft brewers to emphasize the direct link between protected sources of clean water and better beer. In 2014, Washington Wild led efforts to add more than 22,000 acres of low-elevation forest to the Alpine Lakes Wilderness area, and designated nearly 40 miles of the Middle Fork, Snoqualmie, and Pratt Rivers as wild and scenic. Most recently, Washington Wild has stayed true to its roots by bringing stakeholders together as part of a diverse and winning coalition. In 2019, as a member of the Methow Valley Headwaters campaign, Washington Wild celebrated the permanent ban on mining in the scenic Methow Valley. The same year, we led an international coalition of more than 140 tribes, First Nations, local stakeholders, elected officials, and local businesses to oppose logging and mining threats in the headwaters of the iconic Skagit River. As a result of those efforts, the logging threats have been halted, and efforts continue to stop a proposed mining permit. In 2020, Washington Wild helped coordinate a coalition of more than 160 local stakeholders, resulting in state legislation signed by Governor Jay Inslee that banned the harmful practices of motorized section dredge mining in Washington's rivers and streams designated as critical salmon habitat. Washington Wild is also a founding member of the Wild Olympics campaign, working to support federal legislation that would permanently protect more than 126,000 acres of Olympic National Forest as wilderness and more than 460 miles of 19 rivers as wild and scenic rivers. Moving forward, Washington Wild is focusing on how its work to preserve our last remaining old-growth forests, to store carbon, and protecting sources of clean water will address growing impacts from climate change. Also, we are making an organizational commitment to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a top priority in its efforts to protect wild places and access for all. To help fund future efforts in protecting wild lands and rivers, please donate by going to the Washington Wild website and clicking on Donate Now. Together we can continue to protect Washington's wilderness for the next 40 years.